Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, and today I'm joined by licensed clinical social worker Dreya Blume. Dreya has had a private therapy practice for the past 20 years and has also been a student of the tarot for the same amount of time and has been passionate about bringing the cards into the therapy room. So today we're going to talk about using tarot in clinical work. Welcome, Dreya.
Oh, Janine, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we hit record, I was just telling her how fascinated I am about the world of tarot and how much I really appreciate alternative therapy techniques that we can bring into the room to reach different populations, people with different needs. And so I love learning about some of these less conventional styles of what people are doing. So let's first start. Can we talk about what tarot cards are for someone who's listening who doesn't really understand the whole concept?
Yes, absolutely. And I've got a deck here.
Okay.
So there's 78 cards in a traditional or in an official tarot deck. But it's interesting because they were invented in Renaissance Italy. So Northern Italy, early 1400s, and they're an offshoot of playing cards. So playing cards were invented in China. And China, of course, invents paper. And not long after that, paper money. People start using paper money for gambling, for
Hmm.
divination, like it's this amazing material that you can do all sorts of things with. And so playing cards come out of that and they move west. And then playing cards that we know them as we know them today really are developed in Egypt and then coming through northern Africa into Spain and Italy in the 1300s. And somebody had the bright idea to put pictures on these cards, Christian-based imagery mostly. So when
Hmm.
people, it's interesting. So tarot cards come into the world as a card game. So they're used,
Oh.
yeah, like bridge,
Hmm.
actually, which I can never figure out. But it's a card game. And it really lasts as a card game for like 300 years. It wasn't until late 1700s in France that some occult and esoteric minded people decided to connect the imagery on the cards with all sorts of things like ancient knowledge from Egypt, the Kabbalah, astrology, that sort of thing. And so that's later. So tarot, when people get all upset about tarot, it's typically, well, people have been using everything to foretell the future. And this is all because when you think about tarot, I mean, tarot is a loaded word.
Hmm.
So that's why, like, when you ask, okay, so what's tarot? I think a lot of people feel that, well, or believe, tarot is this deck of cards and you use it to foretell the future. But people are using playing cards to foretell the future. I mean, people have used everything, tea leaves,
Hmm.
coffee grounds,
Yeah,
entrails of animals. I mean, runes, you name it. People have used
right.
it. And that really wasn't associated with tarot until later. The issue though is that in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, so in Judeo-Christian tradition, it's not okay to be foretelling the future. It's only high priests. And so any form of divination
Hmm.
is considered sinful. And plus, you've got like the image of the devil and death, even though, again, these are coming out of Christian imagery, Catholic imagery. There's just such, and because of fortune tellers, certainly. So when we think
Hmm.
about a fortune teller, we think about, quote, a gypsy. Right. So the
Hmm.
Roma. And so we have all these associations with gypsies, with tarot
Yes.
cards. And it's interesting because certainly, yes, people use tarot cards to foretell the future, but there's just as many of us who use the cards as a, well, there's 78 pictures. And so it's really very metaphorical, right? Every
Hmm.
picture is metaphorical. So using it more as a projective tool, kind of like an inkblot test, like the Rorschach. That's what I find is often a big obstacle, is that when I mention, oh, I'm a therapist and I use tarot, people will often get bent out of shape. Like, oh my gosh, using tarot in session with clients, like you're foretelling their future. How can you do that? And I'm like, no, I'm not.
Hmm.
That is one way to use it. Again, it's not even their original use, but
Hmm.
I'm using it as a way for clients to connect very quickly to their intuition. So it's like an art therapy based intervention,
Hmm.
really. Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, so it's been around for 500 years. Um,
Wow. Yeah, that's such an interesting history. And I'm so glad you shared that because, I have done a number of interviews with people who use non-traditional therapeutic tools, techniques, things like that. And, someone's always got to be the first. And I always feel sorry for whoever that person was. But then the people following them in Western culture were still, not open-minded to some of these other really rich and insightful practices that can mean so much. And I also unfortunately find in our field that instead of saying like, wow, how do you use that in your practice? The first thing is, how can you do that instead of tell me more about that, which is an unfortunate thing that happens in our field for, I don't know why. Can't explain it.
A lot of judginess, unfortunately. You're right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You said you started these kind of right at the beginning of your private practice. Did you know someone who was doing this? What made you first think about doing this?
Yeah, good question. So I've been in practice since 2004, so 20 years. And it was around the same time I just stumbled on a website. I really hadn't had any interest in tarot. I had never had my cards read. And I always assumed it was just very complicated like astrology. I just thought, oh, it's this. I don't know, it's just never they never called to me. But I found a website and I don't remember why, but it was like an online course on how to read tarot cards, and it was very accessible. This woman, her name is Joan Bunning, Bunning, Joan Bunning, and she's written books, but her website was super cool. And it was right at the same time, again, I don't, synchronicity, I can't remember how it happened, but I ended up, well, I think maybe just the imagery as I was just spending more time looking at the imagery, I think I started to fall more in love with the imagery of the cards because I'd never paid them attention.
Hmm.
So I found a book called 78 Degrees of Wisdom and by a woman named Rachel Pollack. And she, again, I don't know why I would have read it, but I did. And she approached tarot from a Jungian perspective. And so that was the beginning. Then I realized for the first time, oh, you can look at all these images through a psychological lens, through a lens of archetypes,
Hmm.
right? Just these incredibly discrete energies. So each card is an archetype. And that's when I realized, oh, so there's way more to this than just, learning how to read cards with traditional meanings. And I was very lucky at that time because I was teaching as an adjunct at a university. So I had interlibrary loan capacity. So I basically interlibrary loaned as many art therapy books as I could because it also occurred to me almost immediately that, oh, this is like art therapists use visual imagery. I would love to use these as an
Hmm.
art-based intervention with clients. I'm not trained as an art therapist, but I can still use art-based interventions as long
Hmm.
as I don't call it art therapy.
Right.
But I was assuming that the art therapist must have been using tarot, and I found nothing. So I was reading all these books, looking for some sort of model. Like how can I use this with a client? Because it's great reading about Jung and archetypes and symbolism, but actually in session, what would you do? What would you do with the cards? And what I realized was even though there wasn't anybody writing specifically about tarot, almost every visually art-based art therapy activity, tarot cards could apply. You could
Okay.
substitute tarot cards. So I started collecting interventions and activities in a notebook, and I ended
Hmm.
up writing a book, the tarot activity book.
Okay.
Yeah, the book that I wish had been around for me. But
Hmm.
that's when I realized, like, wow, there's a whole world of metaphor and art-based imagery, and tarot cards are perfect. And so, yeah, basically over the last 20 years, it's been just a really beautiful relationship because so I figured out how I could use them with clients.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that tie-in with Jungian therapy is so important. I had a reading a couple years ago, and that was the way that the perspective that it was done. Mine was not a therapy session; it was more of a coaching session. But yeah, I mean, it's again, that's another interesting route to kind of look at the ties that we have with things that we already are familiar with and we already accept. And is an extension of that. And
Yeah.
at least that's the way you decided to start offering it. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. So what I love about the way our field is growing is that consumers have gotten really savvy and
Mhm.
they know, like, I don't have to see the white lady in the cardigan. I can find a therapist that looks like me, that has some aspect of their life like me. They
Mhm.
use a technique that I really find fascinating. And so I'm sure that that's how most people find you, would be my guess.
Yeah, it's funny. I've really dialed down. So currently, I've dialed down my therapy practice because I spend most of my time doing continuing education trainings. But
Okay.
I still have a small caseload. But I do coaching and I utilize tarot, and I also read. I a side hustle as
Hmm.
as a tarot card reader. Again, not as much in terms of divination and foretelling the future, but again, using the cards as a kind of as a portal, not to hell, but
Hmm.
to your soul, you know. So in the past, though, yeah, I mean, it's all about showing up authentically on your website or Psychology Today profile. I mean, I was living for a long time in Southwest Virginia, so not the most, well, it's ironic. I mean, professionally very conservative, but certainly plenty of people into tarot, you know,
Hmm.
just like there are plenty of
Okay.
people into kink and who are poly kind of in these conservative areas.
Yes.
It's all underground.
Yes,
But
unfortunately. Yeah.
yeah. No, for me, it's for because I'm always thinking how, because I love what you said. I think clients are really hungry for somebody with whom they can feel safe being themselves. And so if they're into tarot, you know, how do they know they can trust you? Unless
Right.
you are open about it on your website, like, hey, I'm tarot friendly, or I use symbolism or, you know, art-based imagery, including tarot, whatever it might be, that, you know, they understand, okay, this is a safe
Hmm.
place. I'm just, it's funny, I'm so busy now that I just don't have time for ongoing therapy clients.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So when you've worked with therapy client, so you have this new client, you don't know if they're interested in you because of tarot or not. Like how do you start that session? And then how do you use tarot during the session?
So, two things. One, I'll say I'm a really big believer in doing a spiritual and religious history during intake to get a sense of what's their backgrounds, and it's very open-ended so they can fill in, you know, like what their spiritual practices are, and you know, if they have one, is there religious trauma? So it can come out that way.
Hmm.
And it's a good conversation starter as I go over that with them, because that's something to fill in and then talk about later. The other big piece is the informed consent, which I
Okay.
always, yeah, and people who know me know I always joke like we get this informed consent online and we sign it and we don't read it typically.
Say
So
that
I'm,
to clients all the time. Now
yeah.
you didn't read it, so let me summarize it for you.
Yeah, and so we can use that to our advantage. So what I would
Mm.
do, what I recommend people who want to do this do with new and ongoing clients, where you can say, "Hey, I've updated my informed consent," and just, you know, what I would say is, I just want to go over it just to see if you have any questions. And so in it, there's a paragraph about my therapeutic modalities. So I'm trained in EMDR and emotional freedom technique and accelerated resolution therapy, like these things that a lot of clients don't know. I mean, they maybe heard of EMDR and then, you know, mindfulness, acceptance, commitment therapy, blah, blah, blah. So in there is a little sentence about, and I use tarot. You know, I use tarot as a projective tool to help people connect quickly to their intuition. So that's in there. So when I get to that section, I ask if they have questions, and then I say, you know, hey, and if I think using tarot cards might be helpful, you know, depending on what we're working on, I might suggest or invite you to engage with the cards. But if you also, you know, if you want to use the cards, you can always invite me and say, hey, could we do this today? So now it's out in the open, and then I go on, right? So I don't belabor the point, but now they know, because certainly again, yeah, I want to have on my website that I'm tarot friendly, but and because I want people to self-select out. You know, I don't want
Yes.
someone who's going to be upset by that to use me as a therapist. Like I only want people who are open, because I believe that, you know, we should have a sense of our ideal client, and why not, you know, yeah, why not believe that we can fill 20 or 30 slots with our ideal clients so we can show up fully and they can show up fully.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think it's the spiritual religious history intake and then the informed consent really gets it on their radar.
Hmm.
And you know, they've signed it. They've signed it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I can never imagine. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but I've experienced way more people truly damaged by kind of traditional evidence-based therapies like prolonged
Hmm.
exposure therapy and EMDR, even because the
Yeah.
therapist didn't teach the client how to self-regulate and they sent them out the
Yeah.
door at the end of a session dysregulated. And even Richard Dick Schwartz in IFS, I mean, he's very open
Hmm.
about when he was developing it, he messed up a lot of people because he didn't know what he was doing. And so, yes, it's always good to have a signed informed consent regarding this kind of intervention. But yeah, I just, you know, it's funny. Any other kind of art-based intervention, I'm not going to overthink, but I find a lot of clinicians, they're really afraid. Like, oh my God, what are my
Hmm.
colleagues going to think? Or what will my client
Hmm.
think? And you know, for me, it's, well, yeah, we don't overthink. If I'm going to try an activity. I'm not going to add it to my informed consent and have the client sign off on it. You know, then it would be
Hmm.
50 pages long. Because right, I mean, I my philosophy is it's all about process, not content. And that's what the research shows. I mean, the research shows that it doesn't matter. I mean, from the 1950s all the way up till now, it doesn't matter what you're using if it's,
Right.
if the relationship is strong,
Yep.
the outcome will be positive. And I just read the other day this great study came out of the UK. It was an outcome study with using CBT, and people who had no training, therapists who had no training in CBT, and people who are like master CBTers, cognitive
Hmm.
behavioral therapy people, and the outcomes were the same for clients. It didn't matter how
Hmm.
much training a person had. So that's why for me, again, it's the bugaboo of the word tarot for
Hmm.
some people,
Right.
but also Christian therapists, Christian counselors, like biblical counseling always gets a free pass. Like nobody ever says, "Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, there's no evidence for biblical counseling." It's like, well, I mean, my take is it's going to work with Christians.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And great, good for them, as long as you know you're getting a Christian counselor. But
Mhm.
why do they get a free pass and people who use tarot? And not that, I mean, it's rare. Back in the maybe when I started offering like workshops and how to use it, I would
Mhm.
get a couple people on Facebook who'd be really snarky and mean. Yeah, I think now, and I think so it really there is a big change now. I think with COVID, so many more, especially younger people, are really getting into tarot. And so they want a
Mhm.
therapist who's into tarot or astrology, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so many things have been coming to mind as you're talking. Yeah, I mean, the Christianity thing, just reflects the majority values of our country. And, it
Mm.
is what it is. But I also have had a guest on that talked about religious and spiritual trauma. So we know that there's damage there as well. So anyone who doesn't really know what they're doing or uses it for malice can damage somebody. And that's why when you have someone really skilled at doing something like tarot, it wouldn't it be better for us to look at, like, thank goodness you know how to use that so effectively so your clients can benefit versus that's terrible. Why are you doing that?
Yeah. It's interesting. Again, that there's just so much it's funny because what you just said made me think about a lot of the people that I teach how to do this are worried about like, yeah, how do I do it? But at the end of the day, I think the key is really just being mindful. Like that's
Hmm.
just being present. It's like, okay, if I'm just fully present with my client, whatever tool I'm using, like if I'm really paying attention, I'm paying attention to them and me and our relationship, whatever I use because there's a reason I want to use it, like whatever it might be. I'm deciding, okay, I want to use this in this moment. I think if we're fully mindful, it ends well. And even if it
Hmm.
starts going sideways, we're noticing it. So we can
Right.
say, oh, okay, time out, or we can always stop. Like that's what I tell my clients. I'm like, we're going to throw something against the wall. If it sticks, great. We'll do more. If it doesn't,
Hmm.
we'll do something else. And so tarot shouldn't be any different. Again, I just think it's the name because there's people have been doing research on like they call these metaphoric association cards or
Okay.
metaphor cards. Yeah. So people, especially in Europe, so Russia, Ukraine, Israel too, they've been using picture cards for a long time. So there is an evidence base actually. It's just like tarot. And even I want to say like in IFS, the interactive cards, which nobody bats an eye at. I mean, that's tarot
Yeah.
without the name. So again, I think, the idea of using metaphor, but not just with language, but with imagery. I mean, it's got a long tradition. But yeah, I think again, like to your point, maybe some people can get intimidated, think, oh, I have to be an expert. And I actually tell people it's better if you know nothing about tarot because if you know all the meanings, that can get in the way when you're with a client because
Okay.
you're thinking, oh my gosh, they picked, like this is the card that came up and we have all these associations. For me, it's better just to come to each image totally open to see what comes up.
Yeah, that's almost like not really like managing counter transference, but that self-awareness and looking to make sure that you are showing up as objective as possible. One of the things that I think has to be a part of tarot is something I talk about in my consultation groups that I run fairly often is we don't give ourselves enough credit for our intuition. We've had training and experience, and along the way, we've developed an intuition that maybe something makes us say something to a client is exactly what they needed to hear, but it wasn't even that thought out. It just sort of came to mind. And so I would imagine the same is with tarot, just being really open to your intuition and, what the client is presenting with that day and that moment.
Exactly. It's funny because, I mean, if we talk about, because the evidence base, it's really messed up. And there's a big literature dismantling the evidence base because and kind of because I want to because what you just said, I think, is really important. Intuition, because then creativity. But the idea is, well, we should only be using, and I see this with younger people too, right, coming out of school. Their teachers probably saying, oh, only evidence-based. And just like insurance too, like you only use evidence-based. And what's the gold standard? CBT. But when you read the actual research, the outcome research with CBT, it's really poor. So if there's a 30% success rate, and the thing about CBT is it often is maybe 50% for the first month and then it drops off. So long-term
Mhm.
outcome for the CBT is not as good as one would believe. But that's the idea, like, okay, well, we're going to use CBT with you because that's the gold standard and it's evidence-based. But what if you're the 70% of people for whom it doesn't help, right? I mean, so the whole idea is that, okay, well, I found a study that it helps somebody, so it's evidence-based.
Well,
And like,
such a problem with that phrase anyway.
yeah, I mean, what does that even? What again? It's meaningless because when you think about, again, if you go back to Christian counseling, I mean, if somebody, or I don't know, if somebody gets better because taking cold showers, like if you Google, cold showers depression, there's a million anecdotes on Reddit and people talking about how, hey, it really helped. And so you think, okay, well, it's kind of like flossing, actually. That's the big one, right? Right? There was a big thing a couple of years ago. There was no research ever done on flossing, and yet dentists say you floss, you have to floss.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, it's really fascinating. And what's interesting is, talk about a free pass. When this came out, so actually there's no evidence to support flossing in dental health, yet dentists say you have to floss. So the dentists were saying when this came out, like, well, you should still floss. It's still a good idea. So it's like, okay, you can't have it both ways. So you think, because intuitively it makes sense. All
Hmm.
right, I guess there's stuff between your teeth and you get it out. But the idea that, okay, well, if I am using tarot cards and I see that it's helping my client, great. What other proof? Like, why it has to be some go through all this rigmarole. So anyway, and the other thing too, because this gets into the indigenous traditions, like if somebody comes to us and their connection with healing is, whatever, if it's meaningful for them, I mean, ethically, and the ACA, the American Counseling Association has a whole division around religion, and they've got their own code of ethics. And part of it is we have to meet the client where they're at. So if a client comes to us and says, "Hey, I use tarot to foretell the future. For me, it's my spiritual practice, and I want to talk about that in counseling, and I want to bring in the spreads that I've done," we have to be okay with that. We have to honor that.
Right.
And I think people, it's interesting because regarding what you were saying about intuition, it makes me think about Joseph Moreno with psychodrama, where his whole thing was healing is coming from being creative and being spontaneous. So in the
Mhm.
work we do as clinicians, we have to be able to be creative and spontaneous, to meet the client where they need to be met. And when you have evidence like these manualized, that's why people I think love evidence-based, right? Because you can teach a monkey to do it. It's like, okay, you just follow a book,
Yeah.
right? And that's why prolonged exposure therapy, because I did a year-long internship in the VA 21 years ago, 22 years ago, and they were using prolonged exposure therapy, and all it did was re-traumatize the vets.
Hmm.
It was really
Hmm.
bad because I think people were not following their intuition. Clinicians weren't, right? They were just, again, going according to this manual, and they really messed people up. So, yeah, I think, again, you have to ask, right, how does therapy really work? And because it's the relationship, yeah, we're fully present, following our intuition, being spontaneous. And that's where the magic is.
Yeah. And the only evidence-based data that I really, I mean, obviously the data is important. We have people that do studies and it's good. We do need that. But it comes back to the relationship over and over and over again. Like that's the greatest
Mhm.
criteria or the greatest factor in healing in the therapy room. And yes, in one of my consultation groups today, actually, we were talking about just different treatment styles and, how a client might say, "Oh, my friend's seeing this therapist doing this style." And then inside we might be like, "Oh, well, like, are they thinking that I should be doing that?" Because, we get all in our heads sometimes. And then we have to recognize, like, no, that's their strong suit. I bring something else to the table. And if my client is benefiting from this, then it's the right thing for them. But
Yeah.
the comparison issue can be really huge for us in our work. And if there was just some concrete, like blood test or something we could use in our work, wouldn't that be helpful?
Yeah, it's really an art. I mean, that's the thing, is
It
that it's
is. Yeah.
not a science. It's an art. I
Hmm.
mean, because there's even all this research about psychodynamic therapy, which people, I don't think they even teach psychodynamic. If you think about like Freudian based or Jungian based or just kind of
Hmm.
the depth psychology based. I don't think they even teach that in grad schools anymore. I don't imagine. And yet there's research behind that. I think it's kind of, again, at the end of the day, because research is also super tough because there's a lot of bias that goes into research. The idea of, okay, how are we testing what we're testing? Can you really control for the differences? Again, like if you're testing 100 people with treatment X, how do you know each one of those people, again, like they're totally different and they
Hmm.
could be experiencing their depression for different reasons. And again, their
Hmm.
relationship with who's ever doing the experiment. So that's why I think, it's about legitimacy and it's from insurance, right? Insurance, like, well, we're not going to pay for things
Yeah.
that have been proven. And yet, again, this idea of because I think what we do is an art,
Hmm.
and to be honest, the idea of science, I mean, ideally, what I learned early on was we have to do our own work. Like
Oh,
that's,
yes.
and it's interesting because anybody can pay their money and go to school and become a therapist, right? Become a healer.
Yes. Yes.
And so, when you think about how do we really do right by clients, I think it's because we're doing our best to figure out our unresolved stuff.
Hmm.
Again, that's where we don't, because if you think boiling ethics down to the core, it's like do no harm,
Yes.
right? And so that's why for me, the evidence based, the idea is, well, if you're not using evidence based treatment, you're potentially doing harm, and that's why I'm like, the whole basis on which it rests, I just think is flawed because again, I could say, well, I'm using CBT or even deep, like I love DBT, and I know a lot about dialectical behavior therapy, and yet we know for trauma, it's not really good because it's not somatic based, right? The way that, let's say,
Mhm.
somatic experiencing is. Like we're also, I don't know, I mean, but that being said, maybe, I mean, IFS is not somatic based, and yet you can do trauma work with internal family systems. That's why, again, at the
Mhm.
end of the day, that's why I think it's an art. It's like you've got a therapist, they resonate with certain modalities, and they have a client who either resonates with the therapist and is going to follow them wherever the therapist leads because they're connected, or they're not, they're going to leave. They'll
Yeah.
drop out of therapy with us. But again, I think we want to be taken seriously, especially the psychologists. They got to do research. I mean, that's how they get their PhD. They've got to do
Right.
a dissertation on something. They
Yeah.
have to do research. So it's an interesting question, I think, because, even EMDR was not evidence-based until it was, just
Right.
like,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
got trained in brain spotting a year ago and I'm kind of
Okay.
facing the same thing. And that's especially hard with clients because it's so hard to explain. And I've had a couple clients who like in the first few minutes are like panicking because they're like, I don't know what to do. And they can't
Oh,
understand the concept of like, we're just gonna go with this, just
yeah.
follow me. And but yeah, I think it's so exciting, these new things that we are learning. The more we learn about the brain, the more techniques we can provide, and none of them will
Mhm.
be evidence based until they are, just like you said.
Yeah. Yeah. What drew you to rain spotting?
I'd been considering it for a while. And then I'm ADHD, and so I saw a friend on Facebook post like, "Hey, I'm doing brain spotting training this weekend," and I was like, "I'm gonna do it right now." So I literally went online, found a training, signed up for the next weekend. So yeah, and I loved it. I took phase one and phase two. I'm currently almost certified, and will just continue to do
Oh.
more. I had a training last week that was so beautiful and incredible and
Mhm.
amazing what this very skilled therapist could do in an hour and a half with someone who had lifelong very deep trauma. It like blew my mind just seeing it unfold and the connection between the two people and stuff. So it's the beauty of what we do. We don't want to lose sight of that.
Yeah. That's exciting. I'm happy for you.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I've it's hard to get taught clients to want to switch to that. But the ones that I have are just kind of, I like people that I've worked with for a number of years are just making leaps and bounds in their healing process. And it's, at first I was calling it a magic wand, and I was like, that doesn't sound very professional. So I need to stop saying that.
I don't know, but see, here's the thing, because who do I know? Someone put a little crystal on top of there. I've received brain spotting before, and so they, on the little thing, antenna,
Yeah.
they put a little crystal. Actually, but I'm going to argue that you should say that, like that you want, again, ideally, let's say a year from now, you only have clients who are open to things that you're passionate about.
Hmm.
And so you using that language, again, it kind of filters out people who maybe are not on the same wavelength as you
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
attracts people like, oh, I want a woo therapist, even though you're like, I'm not
Hmm.
woo. But I think people know, again, they can be safe. So I think there's so many people who are into anything spiritual and also, are psychic or have mediumship powers or some sort of,
Yeah.
one of the clairs, right? And they keep it a secret because maybe they've been shamed or they're worried about being shamed. And I think about us doing work as clinicians, and then the client shows up with a part of themselves that's an important part, but we never get to know because they're afraid to tell us.
Hmm.
So I don't know. So I think when you telegraph it like that and you're like using
Yeah.
that language, I think it
Hmm.
maybe is a signal to the right clients that you're their perfect therapist.
Yes. And that's so important. I totally believe in the value of what we put out there to attract the clients we work best with and detract those that we're never going to be a good fit for. And so I think that we have agency to do that. We just have to learn marketing and how to write good copy for your website and things like that so the right people will find you.
Yes, everything that they didn't teach us in grad school.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Oh my gosh, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Before I start wrapping things up, can you tell us if you have a favorite catchphrase or analogy that you like to use?
I do, and you just talk about synchronicity. It's related to what you were just saying. So my favorite phrase that I teach all my clients ASAP is what you focus on will grow, right? Sometimes I'll
Uh,
add what you decide to focus on
mm-hmm.
will grow. And I take that from Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, that book, in terms of being in a concentration camp and deciding to focus on hope instead of not invalidating the tragedy of it, but thinking about, yeah, I want to honor the things that aren't going right. Like I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
invalidate those. I don't want my clients to think that I'm invalidating
Yeah.
what's crappy in their life and why they're seeing me. And if they focus on that, they're not focusing on everything else that is going right, like the fact that they're alive or that they have a roof over their head and they have running water,
Mm-hmm.
electricity, and a flush toilet, whatever it might be. So I'm a big believer in gratitude. And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. And
Uh-huh.
I want
I
them
just
to
had a
learn.
session this
Yeah.
morning, literally, where the
Oh,
conversation was, okay, so you're saying that you feel like you wasted time in certain aspects of your life, but can we pause for a minute and think about the areas that were joyful for you at that same time? And you can just see like the shift. It's like, yes, there were some times that were joyful. I can choose to embrace those. I'm still going to have to work through the other stuff. The other stuff was
yeah.
still really hard and traumatic, but I
Yeah.
don't want to lose sight of moments of joy
Mm,
to be
I love
grateful
how you
for.
reframed that. Yeah, that's beautiful what you did because it's true. I mean, those things did occur. I think people just forget about them because they are focused on this other thing that then takes up all of their attention. And
Hmm.
so the idea, yeah, what you focus on will grow. I want my clients to be paying attention to, where is my focus in this moment and is it serving me?
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
This has been so wonderful. I have learned so much. I have felt like we made such a great connection today. This has been
Oh,
thoroughly enjoyable.
uh,
So, if the listeners want to learn more about this, you've referenced several books that they might look into. Also will put the information you shared in the show notes, including a Facebook group that's specifically around this that I find very interesting. I'm just an observer because I don't do it yet. So there's ways for them to connect with you outside of just this podcast. For all of you hardworking therapists out there, please remember our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.